The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
This is the tale of Boaz. And Joe likes to talk about stories of coincidence or shared joy. And this is that, but this is really a love story. The coincidence in this story is that it started a number of years ago. My wife, Jill, was shopping, and she bumped into a woman from our church while she was shopping, and the woman said that they had a dog that they were going to get rid of. They couldn't keep this dog anymore. And did Jill know anybody who would like this dog? Now, this was a Springer Spaniel, young Springer Spaniel. The couple who was giving it away had rescued it from a family who initially had mistreated it. You know, the collars with the studs on the inside and the short leashes. And it really mistreated this dog at a very young age. And then this family took the dog in when it was about 3 months old. And they were both school teachers, so they kept this spaniel locked up in a garage while they were teaching all day. When they come home, there was so much energy in this dog that it would just run around and it would leap their stockade fence, the 6-foot stockade fence, and run around. And the last thing I think you want to do after trying to take care of children all day is try to catch a wild dog at night. And so after about 6 months, they had enough. And so they were going to get rid of this dog. So Jill said, go check on this dog. And I said, as the dutiful husband, loving husband I am, I said, yes, dear, knowing in my head that there was no way on God's green earth that I was going to come home with a dog, because we had just had our third child in 4 years. Our house was about the size of a postage stamp, and there was no room in that place for any other living, breathing creature. But I was a good husband. I said I would go after work. And I remember parking. I remember walking up to the door of that house. And I remember opening the outside door to get to the screen door. And then there was that moment when I looked through that door, and looking up at me on the other side of that door was that dog. And our eyes locked, and it was like birds imprinting on each other. And I don't remember anything else from that evening. I don't remember talking to the people. All I knew was that I had me a dog. Well, that dog and I became inseparable. Now, the first thing we had to do was we had to come up with a name for this dog, because the people there had named him Goofy. And that just wasn't going to do. A dog needs, like a kid, needs a good name in order to grow strong. They need a good name. And so we turned to that repository of great names, the Bible. And we started paging through, where are we going to find a name for this dog? And we tried on a few ones. We tried on Zedekiah, not quite good. Zerubbabel, Raphael. All good names, but not all that good. And then finally Jill stumbled across the name Boaz. Boaz. Well, there's a name. Got just a hint of royalty to it, dignity in there that every spaniel needs, a hint of dignity. And, called so well, in fact, that sometimes I called my children that, but to their dismay and the dog's dismay, actually. And so we named him Boaz. And the interesting little caveat here is that I have an older brother who lives in Georgia, and we don't talk. We love each other, but we don't talk to each other. So I called him about a month after we got the dog, and I said, yep, we got a dog. What kind? He's a Springer Spaniel. Oh, yeah, we got one of those. He says to me over the phone, he says, what did you name him? I said, we named him Boaz. Silence on the other end of the phone. And then finally my brother says in a whisper, that's the name of my dog. So I think we chose well. Now, Boaz, when he came to live with us, was good, but I think The day that I took him up to Camp Fowler to go to work was, I think, the day that Boaz truthfully and factfully, maybe more truthfully than factually, died and went to heaven. This dog was now a camp dog, the camp dog. And that's a noble position for any dog. He never was out of my sight. He was always around, but he was the omnipresent presence at the camp. And we'd be walking along, and kids would be running down from the chapel or running up from the beach, and they'd go, Boaz, 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 and they'd scratch him every which way but loose. I swear that for a number of years, I wasn't even sure the campers knew that I was there. Because they would go with that, and then every now and then one kid would look up and say, Oh, hi, Uncle Kent. And they go back to petting the dog. Well, that's a noble position for a dog to be in. And it's hard being a camp dog. There's some rules you have to live by. You always got to be nice. That was easy for Boaz. But one of the rules he didn't understand was they had to stay out of the dining hall. And for 2 straight years, I'd go in the dining hall, the dog would sneak in, I'd grab him by the collar, and I was the only one who could ever do that. Grab him by the collar, drag him outside of the door, set him down, and go back in. And we fought that battle for 2 years until we reached a compromise. We reached a truce that I would let him lay in the doorway of the dining hall, and he would stick his nose up over the threshold of the door and lie there with those sad eyes and those droopy, curly ears looking at the campers, and the campers would all look at me and go, You're so mean. You don't treat that dog well. And Boaz would just love it. And so he would stay out of the dining hall until we'd all leave, and then every now and then he'd still sneak in and try to grab some things that might be lying around in the compost bucket, and I'd drag him back out. But he was a busy dog at camp. There were lots of things to do. There were lots of canoe rides to go on, and he'd always jump up in the front of the canoe. He loved to canoe, and he'd stand up in the bow, and he'd be sort of like this mangy bow maid, sort of barking at the water as the canoes would go over Sacandaga Lake, or he would often go with me on the van rides when we'd go to drop kids off to their day hikes or pick them up, and he loved that. And the kids usually loved that, unless he'd been down on the beach and just rolled in a dead fish. And then he'd come sit in the van, and then the kids were less excited about having Boaz sit with them. But he didn't mind at all. He never said a word. And we'd be out all day. We'd be out sometimes 12, 14, 16 hours a day out in the camp. And he would never go home without me, never go back to the cabin without me. And so he'd often come back, and he'd be really hungry because he hadn't eaten all day. But Boaz was so neurotic about not letting me out of his sight. What he would do is he would go to the room and pick up one kibble from his dog dish, and he'd crunch, 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 come into where I was sitting, look at me, make sure I was there, walk back out, pick up one kibble, crunch, 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 and come back around. There were some meals, I swear, he had a negative calorie intake because he was putting on so many miles to get with me. Because you see, I was his owner, but he was my keeper. And he would make sure that I was safe in my place, and then he would go to bed, and there was one piece of furniture that he was allowed to go up on, and it was a manky old wing-back chair that somebody had donated to the camp a long, long time ago. And on that chair, I had a quilt that my great-aunt Sarah had made me, and that was a special quilt that I gave to him because sometimes you give friends special things. And he would lay down, he'd curl up on that quilt, and he would sleep there until we'd get up in the morning to go lead the polar bear session, or we'd get up to drop off the group on the next day. And it's tough now when you're a camp director and you've got a personality like Boaz around you. There are times when I need to talk to the campers and I need their attention. I got to share with them deep gospel truths and things that are really important. And Boaz never liked that. He didn't like it when I wasn't paying attention to him or throwing him sticks. And so what he would often do if I was outside is he would find a tree with a low-hanging branch. And I'd start talking, and he'd start running around behind me beneath that tree. And he'd pick up a head of steam, and then he'd leap up in the air, barking all the time, trying to grab that branch. And he'd come back down and bark, 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 bark. And it's really hard carrying a conversation with children with a barking dog behind you, always upstage. And every now and then, he would get what he wanted. He would bark and he would jump and he would grab that tree. And then his bite would be filled with bark and be hanging down there, kind of suspended between the ground and God with that tree, not knowing what to do now that he had actually caught it. But nevertheless, he was always willing to upstage me when any chance I had. Now, when you're a camp dog at a Christian camp, it meant that you often had to go to church. And I mean often. We went to church a lot. And Boaz didn't seem to mind. He was pretty good. He would lay under the pew most of the times, and when we'd sing, every now and then he'd join in with a good howl or two, and that was always kind of fun, kind of a hallelujah going on. That was for you, Joe.
Thank you. I loved it.
What he really loved was communion, of course, the bread and the wine on the table, and he would sit and stare at that table with just intensity, so wanting to have a piece of that bread and to partake of communion. And there was one pastor who was with us at one point, and Boaz was under me, and she was leading the service, and she, with such exuberance, went through the liturgy. She said, "Come, for all things are now ready." And when she said, "Come," that dog shot out from under the table and came this close from consuming all of the body of Christ. I've never seen such dedication. And when you're a dog at a Christian camp, you hear a lot of scripture, and Boaz was pretty good. He had his favorite scriptures. He did. He liked Genesis 1. He liked the creation story because, as he would often remind me, in that first creation story, dogs, animals, beasts are created before humans. And so he would say, he was my elder, and I had to respect him and treat him well. And he often reminded me of that when we were out on the trail and I was warm and toasty and he was all covered with rain. He would remind me of that. And he wasn't really wild about Jesus, I got to tell you. It was that part about Jesus saying, why should I throw the children's bread to the dogs? Huh? Right? But he did like the Syrophoenician woman's response when she said to Jesus, "Yes, sir, but even the dogs under the table get the children's crumbs." He liked that. He liked that a lot. But I think he really connected with the Psalms. That sort of hope and despair that you get in the Psalms, and that sort of living life out. And his favorite psalm was Psalm 139. And 139 is about God. But in so many ways, it was about Boaz. And it goes, "You have searched me and you know me. You know when I lie down and when I rise up. Even before a word is on the tip of my tongue, you, O dog, know it completely. When I get up in the morning, you are there. When I come to the end, you are still there." I was Boaz's owner, but he was my keeper. He was always present with me. Now Boaz, he was born in a season. We never knew what his birthday was, but we knew it was around Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving's one of those floating holidays. So we always celebrated his birth on Thanksgiving. And he died in a season. And he died, the end came this way. It was Maundy, Thursday. And we noticed that Boaz hadn't been eating for about 2 days. And I called my brother, who's a veterinarian for large animals. And Paul had been on a lot of hikes with Boaz and I, and so he knew the dog very well. And I said, something's going on. What's happening? And my brother said, well, check his gums. If they're all white, that means there's internal bleeding and that he's shutting down. And I checked, and sure enough, they were just bone white. And we knew it was getting close to the end. And so the next day, it was Good Friday. And I did what I normally do on the morning of Good Friday, and I went out and I split firewood for the next season, because that somehow feels right on Good Friday. And I took Boaz out with me, and Jill came out and brought his bed out to make him more comfortable. And every now and then I'd lie down next to him in the grass. And that sort of reversal of roles that we have when death comes to our friends. And I took him up at noon. I drove him to the church in the old Toyota, and I remember sitting through that service, and I don't remember thinking about Jesus dying on the cross that day, but I remember thinking a lot about my dog in my car. And we got home, and that night, I lay next to Boaz the whole night, and we watched Orion throwing sticks for Sirius in the sky all night. And I had taught Boaz all the names of the stars, but he kept forgetting. So I had to keep reminding him. And I lay down next to him with that heavy breathing that he had all night. And we knew it would be over. And so the next day, the plan was this, that I would get up and I would go to the office and get some things, because we would take him to the vet at 8 o'clock when the vet opened, and we would usher in his long sleep. And then we would take him up to camp and we'd bury him in his favorite place. And so I left him and I went and grabbed some things, I don't know what, and I got back, and Jill had brought him out onto the porch of our house, and he was lying on his dog bed with Aunt Sarah's blanket. And he was lying there. And he looked up when I got home, and I sat down next to him, and Jill was there. And he looked at him, because I was his owner, but he was my keeper. And he made sure that I was safe, and he made sure I was back. And then he put his head down, and Jill whispered, "He's gone." And sure enough, he'd waited till I got back to die. So we enfolded that little body of fur in that beautiful quilt by Aunt Sarah. And we brought him up to camp, and we buried him in a hill in his favorite camp. And if even a smidgen of these things that we preach about on Sunday morning are true, someday that dog's going to wake up and realize that he died and went to heaven. And heaven was a camp. And he would come down, and there'd be canoes in that place. And there'd be a manky old chair with a beloved quilt. And he would look up, and running down the hill would be 100 children calling his name. And that's the tale of Boaz.
Well, once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in the house with her mother and father and baby sister. And they lived happily there, but some nights the baby sister cried and kept Mama and Dada up during the night. So that happened one night. So in the morning, when Goldilocks woke up, she yawned and stretched, jumped out of bed, splashed some water on her face, got herself dressed because she was 4 years old now and knew how to do that all by herself. And down the stairs she went, but it was quiet in the kitchen. There was nobody around. Well, she said, "It's such a beautiful day. I'm just going to open the door and peek my head out." And she opened the door, and that soft summer air was right there for her. And she could hear the birds singing. And well, I'll just step outside the door and just look a little bit more around, she thought. So she did. She stepped outside the door, and she looked down, and there was an ant. That ant was crawling along on the ground. Well, there was another ant, and another, and they were making a little parade down her sidewalk. So she joined the parade and marched down the sidewalk and followed them where they went, down a little hole. Well, there was a ladybug there, and that caught her eye with its red and black shell. "Good morning, ladybug," she said. And that ladybug opened up its little beetle shell, and its little wings popped out, and it flew off. Well, butterflies fly kind of crazy, so she was kind of following all over. And the reason they fly kind of crazy is because of that shell kind of in their way, so they don't have the best sense of direction. So she followed that butterfly, or that ladybug, and it landed on a flower right next to a butterfly. And she watched that butterfly open and close its wings. And then the butterfly took off, and they don't fly in a straight direction either, so she didn't know where she was going, but she followed it, and she ended up out in the middle of a meadow. And the butterfly landed on a milkweed, and right next to the milkweed was a spider's web, and it was all filled with jewels. Well, the sun was shining through it, sparkling and shining in the morning. "You're she thought. And as she looked past the spider web, there was the forest. And there was the path, a path going right through the forest. Well, she skipped along and got to the place where it stopped from being meadow to the opening into the deep, dark woods. Chip, 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 chip. She looked down, there was a little chipmunk there, and he stood in her way. She said, "Little chipmunk, you have to let me by. Chip, chip, chip. They're not your woods. Those woods are for everybody to share." Now, maybe that chipmunk was trying to keep her out of the woods, or maybe he was trying to tell her she should go back home because she'd left the house and hadn't told anybody where she was going. But Goldilocks didn't think of that. The chipmunk flicked his little tail up and ran off into the woods. And just because she was talking, pretty soon she heard chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee. Those friendly chickadee birds came along to say good morning to her. That's what she thought. And she said good morning to all of them, and she tried to count how many there were because they liked to come. They're so friendly. And next thing she knew, she heard teacher, teacher, teacher. It was the oven bird. She looked and she looked. They make their nests on the forest floor, but it was too well hidden, she couldn't find it. But then she heard, ah, ah, ah. Up in the top of a pine tree, there was a crow. Good morning, crow. And she cawed right back at him. Caw, caw. Can you caw too? And then she heard, good job. Then she heard, and she looked around. Took her a while to find it, but there was a downy woodpecker coming down a tree, looking for his breakfast too. Then she heard a growl. Oh no, lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! She looked around and she heard it again. Her hand flew to her tummy. It was her stomach. She was hungry. She hadn't had breakfast. She left the house without telling anybody where she was going. She left the house without eating breakfast. And there ahead of her, she could see the cutest little cottage. It had a little thatched roof and a little round-topped red door with geraniums in the window boxes. It looked so friendly. Surely they would have something for her to eat. So she skipped down the path, went up to the door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Nobody answered the door. They must not hear me. My knock's probably just too small. And she tried the latch on the door, and the door opened in. Hello? Hello? Nobody answered her. But across the way, she could see a table with 3 bowls. Must be something good to eat, she thought. And she skipped on in and went up to the first big bowl, and she took a spoonful. Oh, it was just too salty and too cold. She moved that bowl of porridge, scrambled down, went up in the next chair. The middle-sized bowl of porridge, too sweet and lumpy. She liked a little sweet, but not too sweet. So she got down and went over to the 3rd little bowl with a spoon that was just the right size and a bowl that was just the right size, and 1 bite. Well, let's do a 2nd bite. Pretty soon, she had scraped up everything out of that bowl and eaten the whole thing up. Maybe I'll take a little rest, she thought. And she went over to the great big chair. She threw that newspaper out of the way and crawled up and sat down, but she just couldn't quite get comfortable. That chair was just a little bit too big, a little bit too hard. She scrambled down, went over to the next chair, and she threw the knitting needles on the floor and climbed up. Oh, this chair is nice, but it's really too soft, and she just couldn't quite get comfortable. So she got down out of there and went over to the 3rd little chair. Why, it was just the right size. And she sat down in it and it began to rock, and all of a sudden, boom! Oh my goodness, that chair broke all to pieces. Oh my, she said. You know, she'd gotten up so early and had been on such a long walk, and that porridge was warm in her belly. She was feeling a little sleepy. So she went up the stairs. And she looked around, and there was a great big bed right there. So she climbed up into it, but this bed is too hard for me, she said. She got down, she went over to the next bed. It was so pretty with a soft pink quilt. She got in that one, but she sunk down into it, so that wasn't comfortable. She went to the next bed. Why, it was just the right size. She laid down. It was just the right softness. She pulled that quilt up under her chin and she fell fast asleep. Well, while she was sleeping, guess what? The owners of the house came back. Do you have any idea who lived there? It was Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. In they came. They hung up their coats like good little bears. It had been a little cool that morning. And they went over to have their breakfast. "Oh, somebody's been eating my porridge," said Papa Bear. For the spoon was on the table, the porridge was spilled. Mama Bear looked at her medium-sized bowl. "Well, somebody's been eating my porridge," she said. Baby Bear looked at his bowl. It was empty. "Somebody's been eating my porridge," he said, "and they ate it all up." "Oh my," said Papa Bear, "somebody's been sitting in my chair." How could he tell? His newspaper was on the floor. He hadn't even gotten to read it yet. Mama Bear looked at her chair. Her knitting needles and ball of yarn were all the way across the floor. "Somebody's been sitting in my chair," she said. Baby Bear looked at his chair. His lip began to quiver. "Somebody's been sitting in my chair, and they broke it all to pieces." "Oh, don't worry," said Mama Bear. "I'll fix it. And I'll make some more porridge," said Papa Bear. "But I wonder who the intruder was. Maybe they're still in the house." Well, they tiptoed, as best they could, because they were bears after all, up the stairs. Papa Bear said, "I know I made my bed today, but now it was all messed up. Somebody's been sleeping in my bed." Mama Bear looked at her bed. She knew she'd made her bed that morning. "Somebody's been sleeping in my bed," she said. Baby Bear looked at his bed and said, "Shh, somebody's been sleeping in my bed." And there she is. And with that, Goldilocks woke up. Her eyes popped open. "Oh!" she said when she saw the three bears standing right there in front of her. I better be going," she said, and she started to run. But Mama Bear said, "Little girl, don't run, don't run. Everything is okay. Tell us who you are and how you came to be here." "My name is Goldilocks, and I went for a walk, and I was hungry, and I ended up here." "Oh my," said Mama Bear. "We want to get you home to your mother. Do you know your whole name?" "Yes, it's Goldilocks." "You did say that." "Do you know where you live?" "I do. I live at 23 Woodway Drive." "And do you know your phone number so we can call your mother?" "Oh, I do," she said, and she told them her phone number. So they called the mother up, and the mother answered the phone. "Hello, hello? We have your little girl here. We'd like her to get you two to get back together again." "Well, where are you?" said the mother. "I will be right over." And they told her their address. And Mama Bear hung up the phone and ran as fast as she could through her yard, across the meadow, into the woods, to where the home of the three bears was. Now, Mama wanted to yell at Goldilocks, but she was so happy to see her, she couldn't help but pick her up, lift her in her arms, and give her a great big hug and say, "I'm so glad to see you. I'm so glad you got us back together." "Well," said Mama Bear, "you did teach her name, her address, and her phone number, so we could call you. And even if we didn't know the phone number, we would have gotten her over to where you live, because she knew her street and her town. And that's so important for little children to know. So we're glad it all worked out. Well, thank you, the bear family, for taking good care of my Goldilocks." And off they went back home. And that's the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, and how she came to leave her house and wandered off into the woods, just following the birds and the bees. And how she got reunited with her mother and father, because she knew her name, her address, and her phone number. The end.
This is what I would do at camp, because the last story was the tale of Boaz, the T-A-L-E, and this story is the tale of Boaz, T-A-I-L. Because the campers would always ask me, Boaz was a Springer Spaniel, and they dock the tales of Springer Spaniels, and this one came that way. And they'd say, Uncle Ken, how come Boaz is such a short tail?" And I would say, well, and this is what you do when you're a storyteller. You remember a story in your head, and you start putting in your own stuff into it. And you say, well, there once was a time when Boaz had the most beautiful tail of all the animals up at Camp Fowler. And he'd walk around with that big wavy tail back behind him, and everybody go, ooh, Boaz, you got such a beautiful tail. And everybody liked it, but Fox didn't like it, because Fox thought that he should have the most beautiful tail of all the animals around Camp Fowler. And Fox decided that he was going to trick Boaz one day. So Boaz is walking around one day, and now it's the middle of the winter, and there aren't campers around, so Boaz is a little bored. He's walking around, and Fox walks through center camp with a string of fish. And Boaz goes, hey, Fox, where'd you get those fish? Where'd you get those fish? Fox said, well, it's easy, Boaz. All you have to do is dig a hole in the middle of the lake and put that tail down in the middle of the hole, and the fish will bite it. You pull your tail up, you get the fish. Oh, I can do that. Yes, Boaz, you can, but I got to tell you, what you want to do is you want to leave your tail down in that ice, down in that water a long time, because you'll feel the nibbles at first. Those are the little fish. And then it'll start to hurt a little more. Those are the bigger fish. And then it'll really start to hurt, and that's when you want to pull it out. That's when you get that big fish on your tail. You got it? Oh, yeah. Thanks, Fox. Thanks. Oh, boy. And so Boaz ran out in the middle of the lake, dug a hole in the middle of the lake, came up, sat down, put that big, beautiful, long tail down in the middle of the lake, and sat down. Sat in the middle of the lake with freezing all around him, sat there waiting. And it started to tingle a little bit. He says, oh, I bet that's the bluegills down there, or the rock bass. It's just nibbling away. I don't want them. I want something bigger. And he sat there a little while longer and it hurt a little more, and he thought, oh, that's probably largemouth bass. That would be good, but I want to hold out longer. And it hurt. Got really hurting bad. And he said, well, that's got to be a great big old northern pike. I'm going to take that. And he jumped up and he turned around really fast, and as he did it, he heard a pop, because he had sat down in that hole so long, that hole just froze over that little tail of his, and when he went up, he popped that big tail off, and he looked down in that ice, and there was his tail floating down to the bottom of the lake, and Boaz had lost his tail. So every time he'd go back out on that lake, every time he'd get in a boat, he'd start looking out. He'd look out this side of the canoe, and then he'd look out that side of the canoe. And the canoes would be going like this, and they'd say, okay, what's Boaz doing? And I'd say, he's looking for his tail. He's looking for his tail out there, because he's going to find that beautiful tail. And the day he finds that beautiful tail, he's going to stick it back on, and once more, he's going to have the most beautiful tail of all the animals at Camp Fowler.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.